Hello, welcome to Washington Talk. I'm Young-Gyo Kim. Now that the first Biden-Moon summit has concluded, eyes are set on how the two allies, the US and South Korea, will go forward from here and how North Korea will react. Today we'll discuss these and more. Joining me is Patrick Cronin, Asia-Pacific Security Chair at the Hudson Institute. Dr. Cronin spent more than 3 decades in the US government and think tanks, specializing in Asia-Pacific security. David Maxwell also joins us today. Mr. Maxwell is Senior Fellow at the Foundation for Defense of Democracies. He was a planner for the United Nations Command and the ROK U.S. Combined Forces Command. Welcome to the program.
Thank you.
Thank you.
President Biden and President Moon have clearly expressed their commitment to expanding cooperation and shaping the shared future of the two countries in accordance with democratic values. In the past, the two leaders of the two countries have always been emphasizing the ironclad alliance between the two democratic countries, but was there anything special? Was there anything particularly different this time, Dr. Cronin?
Well, thank you. It's so good to be here. And I think the joint statement underscored those same terms that we've always heard in the past. The ironclad alliance, this is a linchpin of peace and security, and not just on the Korean Peninsula, but in the region. But I think the fundamental difference here was significant. There was a difference of omission and commission, if you will. So I think the omission was we didn't really hear much about the contentious issues that have kind of weighed down the U.S.-South Korean alliance in the past, partly because they had removed some of the underbrush in advance. The special measures agreement took care of the burden-sharing debate that's been going on for the last couple of years. The operational control, wartime OPCON transition issue was sort of handled exactly with the way the U.S. wanted it, which was to be conditions-based, so there's no dispute between Seoul and Washington on that issue. The missile guidelines were eradicated, which pleased Seoul. Contentious issues, and even North Korea policy, which might be contentious, was sort of upstaged by the larger urgent challenges of what we saw as the commission, the difference here. So the difference is the breadth of ambitions in this joint statement, in this summit. It surpassed even the 2009 joint vision statement. That was when Lee Myung-bak, having been elected in early 2008, started to reaffirm the U.S.-South Korean alliance and really talked about a broader agenda of open democratic societies and free markets. That's sort of what we saw here in 2021. But even well beyond that, going into very specific issues about technology like 6G and quantum and green technology, and very mindful of the rules of the road, peace in South China Sea, not just on the Korean Peninsula, for instance. So on a domestic political note, I guess I would say the difference is you now have a progressive leader in Moon Jae-in, not the conservative Lee Myung-bak, embracing alliance diplomacy in a way that it's really seen as a traditional conservative strength, not a progressive issue.
Mm-hmm. Mr. Maxwell, why was the Biden administration putting so much emphasis on the alliance between the two democratic countries? Was there more need to do so at this particular moment?
Well, I think that, particularly democratic values, I think when we look at great power competition, it might best be described as political warfare among the revisionist and rogue powers, as our national security strategy and defense strategy describes them. These are led by authoritarian regimes versus the like-minded democracies, the U.S. and South Korea, Japan, Australia, India, these like-minded democracies seek to respect and protect sovereignty and the rules-based international order. So the conflict is really between closed societies and open societies, and the foundation of open societies is democracy. And of course, China is the leading authoritarian regime in this great power competition. So it's important to understand its vision and objectives in order for democracies to counter that vision. And, in short, China's vision is that it seeks to export its authoritarian political system around the world in order to dominate regions, co-opt or coerce international organizations, create economic conditions favorable to China alone, and displace democratic institutions. And so this summit and the agreements resulting from it really describe a blueprint for the future of the alliance, which goes well beyond the military threat from North Korea. And the alliance has matured, it has evolved, and it's come to a point where there are advanced levels of cooperation in the Indo-Pacific and really throughout the world, and now even in space. So the alliance remains ironclad and the linchpin in the U.S. alliance system, but it's moving to the next level. And this summit might well be an inflection point for the alliance.
Dr. Cronin, did the summit show that the U.S.-ROC alliance is not only limited to deterring North Korea's nuclear ambitions, but also to keep a check on China's expanding power?
To some extent, it certainly did that. And you would, if you were in Washington or in Beijing, you'd probably say that, although the Chinese officials would put it differently. I think South Korea would be a bit wary about saying this was about anything against China. Rather, as the Biden administration has made clear, a good China policy is a good Asia policy. That is, get your own competitiveness in order, get your own alliances strong, outcompete in high technology and in other areas, shape the operating system, as Kurt Campbell would say, the rules of the road. And that's why you had phrases like we're standing for peace and security in the South China Sea and the Taiwan Strait.
Mr. Maxwell, after the summit, President Moon Jae-in told at a luncheon with leaders of South Korea's main political parties that the South Korean government is communicating with China over the result of the U.S.-ROC summit. How will this be accepted by Washington?
Well, first, I don't think it was well received in South Korea, particularly by the opposition party. The U.S. certainly recognizes the challenging position of the ROC, vis-a-vis China and the United States. It is the shrimp among whales. 25% of its trade is with China. And of course, South Korea has to be wary of the past Chinese economic warfare against the South, particularly during the THAAD deployment. But another 25% of South Korean trade is with the Quad. And so the ROC does have options. But it's important for South Korea not to kowtow to China. And we should leave that kowtowing to North Korea. Rather than focus directly on China, the alliance, I think, is really focused on protecting the rules-based international order. Unfortunately, China is the biggest threat to that order. And if China were to embrace the rules-based international order, then there would be no need for an apparent focus on China. China can make a choice to be a responsible member of the international community, and that would be a good thing for all.
In addition to that, President Moon also told parliamentary leaders that a large-scale face-to-face U.S.-South Korea military exercise is unlikely to happen in the near future due to the COVID-19 pandemic. Do you think this was discussed during the summit?
I certainly hope it was. It was certainly discussed the week prior at the U.S.-Korean Integrated Defense Dialogue, and as well as the 2+2 talks that took place previously. We've been conducting these exercises, Ulchi Focus Lens, Ulchi Freedom Guardian, and now I think it'll be Dongmain 21-2, really for the past 30 years, with one specific purpose. And this is following the changeover of South Korean and U.S. military personnel in the summer. The ROC-U.S. Combined Forces Command and the subordinate component headquarters, air, ground, sea, your naval, marine, and special operations, they have to conduct this combined command post training exercise using computer simulation because it's necessary to train on the various scenarios of the North Korean People's Army that they will use if they attack the South. And so the theater level commands must train on the defensive plans to defend South Korea. And so this training is very necessary. But I think it's a fantasy to think that using these exercises as a bargaining chip would bring Kim to the negotiating table. Kim's political warfare strategy and blackmail diplomacy simply exploit this training to meet Kim Jong-un's objectives, which are, of course, to split the ROC-U.S. alliance, weaken the combined military forces, and drive U.S. forces off the peninsula because they can no longer train. And so we really cannot accept this fantasy belief that Kim Jong-un will come to negotiate if we cancel exercises. Right. It's also not helpful for President Moon to discuss canceling the exercise due to COVID. After President Biden promised 550,000 vaccinations for ROC military personnel. I'm sure they could vaccinate all exercise participants prior to the August exercise. Furthermore, the ROC and U.S. Combined Forces Command has conducted two major exercises during the COVID era, both in August of 2020 and March of 2021, and there were no reported COVID cases. So it is apparently able to implement effective mitigation and force protection measures during this COVID era.
Dr. Cronin, if we go back to the joint statement, it particularly mentioned the Singapore Agreement and the Panmunjom Agreement among all the past agreements the two countries made with North Korea. Shall we view this as the Biden administration endorsing these two agreements as the Moon administration interpret this? Wasn't President Biden critical of the Singapore summit in the past?
Yes, I think the Biden administration is de facto embracing these important agreements that were made, Panmunjom first, and then the Singapore summit. Now, there's not a contradiction in my mind in terms of criticizing Trump's rush to the summit and not necessarily being prepared for detailed discussions that would follow, not insisting on them, not being more disciplined in rhetoric, not tweeting out that we love each other, we're exchanging love letters. There was a whole tone to Trump's approach in style that made it possible to criticize it. And in hindsight, I think President Biden is right to criticize the lack of a common definition on denuclearization, for instance, that we still don't have with North Korea. So there are reasons to criticize it. And yet, inserting the Singapore Declaration, inserting Panmunjom sort of language and embracing that in the Biden-Moon joint statement accomplishes two things. One, it highlights the continuity from Trump to Biden, so it aligns the U.S.-South Korean policy by putting a new relationship with North Korea and a peace regime on a par with the ultimate goal of denuclearization. So it's marrying these otherwise disparate goals in one document in now the Biden administration. And secondly, it's giving a modest diplomatic opening to North Korea. It's not giving major concessions, but it is letting North Korea know that the United States is not interested in just ultimatums or all or nothing diplomacy. It's prepared for the practical, calibrated, step-by-step, small deal diplomacy that might be of interest to North Korea. And what we don't know yet is whether North Korea is in fact interested.
Dr. Cronin, it was confirmed that Sung Kim will continue to serve as ambassador to Indonesia in addition to special representative for North Korea. What can we learn from this fact?
Well, Sung Kim is one of our best ambassadors, but in a word, what he needs to do is lead now as the North Korea policy sort of leading position inside the United States government. That's tough to do because he's a career ambassador and foreign service officer. And even though he's done this role before, after the Trump administration, where President Trump, his rush to the summit meant the downgrading of special representatives. They were no longer the lead negotiators. Trump was the lead negotiator. We want Sung Kim, I think, to be the American lead negotiator at this point. So we want to build up his leadership position and credibility. He wants to do that, I think, lock in the fact that he's got tremendous support, both in the State Department from, Secretary Blinken to Deputy Secretary Wendy Sherman, who's visiting him in Jakarta this week, to all the way down across the White House to the president and to the Defense Department, the intelligence community. He really does have a whole of government support and team behind him, but he needs to leverage that as much as possible. He also needs to ensure diplomatic overtures to North Korea at least do the minimum to preempt a return to North Korean brinkmanship. So he needs to try in these back channel discussions that are undoubtedly beginning to make sure that North Korea stays interested in the negotiations.
Mr. Maxwell, what does Ambassador Sung Kim need to do as he follows up with the result of the summit?
Well, I think Patrick has laid it out very well. I think that one of the things we can assume is that, he immediately assumed the role of acting assistant secretary for East Asia Pacific when the Biden administration came into office, in addition to his role as the ambassador to Indonesia. And I think that was because he had a leading role in the development of the policy, conducting the policy review. And so I think his appointment really shows that he is the point man. And to all Patrick's points, he is the most well-qualified, has deep knowledge and experience with North Korea, and he is prepared to take the lead. And so I agree with Patrick that he does need to reach out to North Korea. He's reached out to Japan today. He's in discussions with his Korean counterpart. And so I think that he really has an opportunity to push diplomacy forward. But we should never forget that it is Kim Jong-un that has to make the decision to negotiate. And we have seen his recalcitrance for many years.
Mr. Maxwell, when we go back to before the summit, the Biden administration has been stressing a lot how they're putting the human rights at the center of the foreign policy. But then when we see the joint statement, it had only one sentence that mentioned North Korean human rights.
When it comes to North Korea, because Kim Jong-un must deny human rights in order to remain in power. But in the fact sheet, the alliance announced the U.S. ROC Democracy and Governing Consultations, the DCG, which is going to serve as a mechanism for coordination on human rights and democracy promotion efforts at home and abroad. And so this DCG really has the opportunity for both sides to work together on human rights broadly. But I expect that this will also mean that they will be able to discuss human rights in North Korea directly. So I think that this is a positive step forward. And I think that the focus on human rights, and we need a human rights upfront approach to accompany denuclearization.
Dr. Cronin, your thoughts?
Well, I agree with everything David said. And while you have other human rights abuses going on around the world, including in China, think about Hong Kong or Xinjiang, think about Myanmar, just to talk about Asia. North Korea's now got to get in a queue to talk about their human rights abuses as well. But they did put it on the table. You are getting prepared for hopefully inviting Kim Jong-un over for a formal dinner at some point in the diplomacy. So you don't want the human rights issue to be the centerpiece of that table, but they've put it on the table. It's there. It will be discussed in the future.
Dr. Cronin, Mr. Maxwell earlier said it's now North Korea's turn to make some moves. Meanwhile, a South Korean government official said North Korean leader Kim Jong-un has been seen less frequently this year amid concerns over the global coronavirus pandemic. What shall we expect next?
Yes, I mean, some people have talked about whose side of the court is the ball on. And for me, we're all on the same court. Whether it's the pandemic or whether it's a future arms race or climate change, we actually are in this together, whether we know it or not. But what to expect on a more practical level? I think we're going to expect one of two things, right? One, we're going to expect quiet diplomacy to suddenly come out in the open into more visible engagement in negotiation, or alternatively, we're going to see North Korea take more assertive actions and issue more assertive demands and make more sort of condemnation in its rhetoric.
Mr. Maxwell, your final thought.
Well, I think Kim and the regime are dealing with the COVID crisis and not only trying to defend against an outbreak, but also using it as an excuse to further oppress the Korean people and deny their human rights. Kim must be concerned about his exposure, but he's also limited his engagements to what appear to be high-profile events where he can focus on furthering his political ideology as the solution to the North's problems. But we should make no mistake, it's that his deliberate policy decisions that are causing the suffering, not sanctions, not COVID, not natural disasters. Kim has the resources from his global illicit activities to solve problems, but he prioritizes nuclear weapons, the military, and the elite over the welfare of the Korean people in the North. But what happens next really depends on Kim's assessment of the success of his political warfare strategy and his blackmail diplomacy. He's going to try to set the conditions for negotiations by forcing the Biden administration to give concessions in the form of sanctions relief in return for a promise to negotiate. And of course, we cannot allow that to happen.
Well, right after the summit between the two leaders of the U.S. and South Korea, U.S. Secretary of State Antony Blinken said the ball is now in North Korea's court. And we have yet to hear what North Korea says about the Biden administration's approach. Dr. Cronin and Mr. Maxwell, thank you so much for your time today.
Thank you.
And thank you.
And that does it for this week's Washington Talk from Voice of America. Please join us again next week for more analysis.